Okay, I was thinking today if we're dealing with quads in terms of the forms that life can take. We look at easily the animal and the vegetable, and what fills out that quad. Well, everybody always says animal, vegetable, or mineral, and they're looking at things in terms of three, which means that essentially it gives us the animal life, the vegetable life, and chemical compounds. What is the other one? Well, the other one would be that elusive area where they're talking about viruses. Is it alive? Is it not alive? What exactly is it? Essentially, we're talking about chemical compounds that are essentially little computers. They're little physical computers. They reconfigure their size, their shape, change and bend themselves around, splice themselves to other ones, mutate. As such, they mimic life, but they are not life as we know it. They're on the other side of that limit line. Two on one side, which would be the chemical or mineral and viral, and two on the other side, which would be plant and animal. So just another perspective with which to classify things, looking at life as making up a quad of animal, vegetable, mineral, and viral. Let's see, what is it? It's the 28th of June at about 10 minutes to 9 in the morning. And the other thought I had was for alter ego. In terms of dealing with alter ego, when we're dealing with loss, I had a dream last night about my peach tree. I planted this tree 3 years ago, and I had great hopes because I love peaches, of being able to can the peaches and make peach pies and just enjoy a fresh peach off the tree. That was something of a childhood dream. I always loved orchards and things, so it goes way back into how much importance I put into having a peach tree. Now, there was a shift because when I planted that tree 3 years ago, it didn't really matter which peach tree it was. Any peach tree would have done, but I really wanted a peach tree. So I planted a tree, and the very first year that it came to bearing fruit, there were only 4 or 5 peaches showed up on it, which was 2 years ago. And at that time, the dog came out and jumped up and knocked them all off the tree because the dog liked to play with them, and the dog was still very puppyish. So I said, okay, well, I've lost them this year, but there were only 4 or 5, that's fine. Well, the next year, I got about 20 peaches on the tree, and I said, great, no matter what the dog does this year, the tree's a little bit bigger, the dog's a little less playful, more old, I'm going to have these peaches. And the dog didn't knock them down, but just as they were starting to get a little bit plump, a little bit towards, oh, maybe we're going to make it, the little neighborhood girl came over when Mindy was playing with her in the backyard here while I was not around, and little neighborhood girl picked all my peaches off the tree because they were fun to throw around the yard. I was livid. I was enraged because now I had figured after the first year that it was going to be a process of another year that I had to endure in order to get peaches off of my tree. And I couldn't even go out and buy another peach tree and plant it and get fruit any earlier. That was the best I could do. Well, I said, okay, this next year she's not going in the backyard all summer long. The dog doesn't really care anymore. We'll see what happens. This year I had about 200 blossoms on the tree that turned into peaches. 200 peaches on my tree. I think actually the first 2 years of having them picked off helped it along so that it ended up responding by saying, oh yeah, well, I've got to survive. I've got to procreate here, so I'm going to come out with all these peaches. And in fact, all of those peaches are still there. But I am so worried about something happening to them, either by birds coming down and devouring them all, or the gardeners coming in and trimming it back or something, any kind of chaotic event that I can't even imagine. I'm so worried about that, but I had a dream about my peach tree last night. And in this dream, I dreamed that the other neighborhood little kid, a little boy, who is the brother of the little girl that pulled the peaches off, they were having a party over there for a birthday or something at their place, which is 2 doors away. And the little kid came over when nobody was watching, and he pulled off all of my peaches. Now, in this dream, that was it. Once those peaches were pulled off, the tree would never try again. It wouldn't bear fruit again because it wasn't worthwhile. I knew this in my dream. The sense of loss was absolutely amazing. But the point for alter ego is that I went over to confront them at the party in a very nice way, because they really had no hand in doing this, and the kid was just having fun. So I went to confront them at the party, and I wanted to come up with some way of having them compensate me for the loss of my peaches that would make me feel good again, that would make it all okay. And I couldn't think of one. At first I thought, well, what if they buy me 4 or 5 other trees to make up for it? And I said, well, yeah, but I could buy 4 or 5 other trees, but when I put them in, there's still going to be a waiting period and a lot of anxiety now that all of the fruit's going to get ruined, even though that's unlikely. What if they bought me a bunch of peaches? Well, that doesn't do it either, because I wanted to grow them on my own. What if they just bought me the best peach tree in the whole world from some special place? Well, no, because it's not any peach tree, it's this peach tree. And it occurred to me, why is it this peach tree? And how does that compare to when you lose a loved one in a long-term relationship? If you have a relationship and somebody jilts you for somebody else, that's the same thing. If you have a marriage and you lose somebody to death, that's the same thing. Divorce must be very much like that. In other words, a lot of the things that alter ego is going to have to address come down to this stupid peach tree. So why is it that nothing else in the world, no combination of things, can make it all right? Well, because the peach tree is not an object, it's a process. And that process has defined itself uniquely, because it's not a linear process, it's a nonlinear process. In other words, when you talk about the potholes in the road of life, there's no way to expect where they are, but they do change the course you've taken. And when you look behind you and see that winding course, you can tell that this is familiar ground. In other words, it's the one true path through chaos that you can actually understand because you've been there. Now, naturally, things may come into a different light, and you may put them into a different context. You realize that you were actually snaking your way through a bog or a swamp instead of a desert. But it doesn't change the path you took, because that much remains certain. Now, of course, yes, memory fails, and you look at things incorrectly, but only from an objective standpoint. Subjectively, you look at something and you remember it exactly the way it was subjectively. And therefore, even if it changes in your mind daily from what the path was you actually took, it always seems like the path you took. And you still associate it with those items that you can see as milestones along the way. Now, for me, for this peach tree, it was an ongoing process of all the trials and tribulations, which represented the only reason to go forward, the only reason to continue, were all the motivations I had for wanting a peach tree to begin with. But they were all centered on nurturing this particular peach tree. Now, this is something that we're going to have to address. I don't have the answers here. I just have some interesting questions as to why nothing else in the world, no combination of things, everything else taken together, can compensate for such a loss. It takes time for the mind to unwind the justifications, and nothing can balance it. Here we get right back into the notion of a binary switch, switching from looking at something and saying, I need it to survive, to saying, no, I can survive without it. Looking at something and saying, I'm constantly hurt and nothing will make me happy again, to actually being happy again. And what happens to the hurt? You don't ever completely lose it. It never is ever removed from you. Rather, it is merely downgraded continually, and other things become more essential. And yet, at the moment that something strikes that in your memory, it can well back up years later with as much sadness, or as much joy, for that matter, as it originally generated, the event originally generated, either its beginning or its ending. And so, there's something to do with the relationship between the linearity of process and the interference pattern holographically. And just as we've been talking about getting into the Fourier equations, F-O-U-R-I-E-R, and I believe it's pronounced Fourier. I believe his first name was Georges, who worked in the 40s and came up with equations that translated waveforms into interference patterns and interference patterns back into waveforms. something in those equations is going to give us the key again to the binary switch. Because the binary switch says you flip from state A to state B and process C begins. What's the D? The D is that interference pattern between structure and dynamics. Because there's going to be that fourth one. But when we look at it as we take state A, we move it to state B, and process C begins. The force that's applied to switch it from state A to state B, that indeed is D. That's the interference pattern. That's aptly named D in this example because it deals with desire, it deals with that D of the KTAD. Now, the reverse of that, or inverse of that, is also true, meaning that you could have state A could be created, well, let me see, how do I want to phrase this? You apply a force to state A, and it changes to state B and allows the process to go. Whereas, theoretically, a process could act upon state A, changing it to state B, which actually causes the process D. So the question as to whether it's a causal relationship, which would be more of a linear way or a typical SBOS left-minded way of looking at it, is that you apply a force to A, switch it over to B, which then causes C. And the force you apply could be called D. Or the other way of looking at it is you apply a force to A, switches it to B, and that allows a process of C to go on, and you still applied force D. So the question is as to whether something is just opened like a gate is opened, or whether something actually acts as a catalyst to begin something, is getting back to the idea of whether it is merely a gravitational type thing or whether it actually comes into contact and has a physical reaction between the two. Does a process begin because you lower a resistance to something and allow it to go on, or because you raise the resistance to something else that is an inhibitor that prevents something from going on? Or does a process go on because you create a potential, or because you diminish a potential, which is going to upset equilibrium, or because you apply a current, or because you shut off a current, which starts getting into the magnetic effect of things and electrical attraction, or because you have power and apply power, or you withhold power. Now, this obviously grows into a pretty big spiral, because if you take the concept of each of these, we've looked at a binary state of PRCP, or PRCO, and when we've looked at that binary state on each of those, we can then see that we can create a causal or non-causal situation with each one. Causal is when you apply something and it makes something happen. Non-causal is when you withhold something and it happens because of the holism of the system minus what you've taken out. And yet even that's a binary state. You see, we begin to use binaries to build quads, and we move backward from that, and we can always spiral and spiral and spiral farther backward. But until we get to the point where we have spiraled backward so far that there is no functional difference between where we are and where we began, we have not completed the formula for the unified field theory. So keep in mind those four different universes that we talked about: the existence and negative existence, and the left and right-minded views of things, the spatial view and the temporal view. And that those four make up the essential building blocks we're going to grow from. That's gotten us up to 16. We originally only had 4: time, space, mass, and energy. Mental relativity added thought, knowledge, ability, and desire. Mental relativity split thought, knowledge, ability, and desire, not by creating 4 new elements, but by saying the way in which those elements arranged themselves became 2 different ways, temporal and spatial, giving you left-minded and right-minded. And so, first part of the work is to define exactly what happened there mathematically, when we have these different equations that are applied to one and applied to the other. Let's see what that translation effect is to go from one to the other, because one will appear to be a waveform, one will appear to be an interference pattern in terms of left-minded and right-minded equations. So if we have these equations, one a waveform, one an interference pattern, and can describe them as such, then the Fourier equations should allow us to be able to figure out what kind of mechanism is at work that translates one to the other, that causes it to shift from one place to the other. And when we do that, then we can come up with the mathematics that creates the shift among all of them by transmuting it. In other words, the shift that occurs is going to change around the scale. You will go from a K and create a T by applying a potential, for example. Or then you will go from a T to, if you go from a T to an A, you might apply a current. The operation that is going to be included to translate from one to the other is going to be a different operation in which each case. It will probably be a different operation moving in different directions. It will probably be a different operation moving in left-minded circles, left-minded Z patterns or right-minded circles. But the point is, we have all the building blocks. We have all the pieces now. And back when we were creating Dramatica, one of the big things we were doing was sitting on the floor with all of the names we knew existed, trying to figure out how the elements went together at the bottom of each class, rearranging them in all kinds of different patterns. We didn't know if they were individually arranged, if they were arranged by pairs, if they were rearranged by quads, if they shifted their position all over the 64 or just within a quad, or within the quads within a set, or what happened. And finally we realized that it was actually rearranging the pairs within the sets that occurred from class to class to class. Now, that rearrangement gives us exactly that feeling of one thing coming out of left field, because it goes from the K class to the A class to the T class, and they have this arrangement that each of which allows for archetypal characters to be created. However, when we move to the D class and use the same permutation, the last step of the permutation, we end up with archetypal characters not being allowed to be created. They violate that rule of not having the same 2 elements out of the same quad. So, obviously, we have the process under lock and key. It's at work. We've already created it in a matrix, but we don't understand mathematically what's happening. The point is, the processes used to go among those are all the same. The shift that occurs from a K to an A to a D to a T, all of those things, no matter which direction you go, is all a logical progression, and it makes sense. But the thing that's changing that doesn't make sense is the way that we are putting confines on it. In other words, if we have 3 things that work one way, we've got one thing that works another way, and we're always going to end up with 3 one way and 1 another way. And because of that, all we have to do is follow the natural progression of going from wherever we are through a second one, a third one, and to the 4th one. And when we've gone through that progression, which is quite natural, suddenly we find we've flipped a binary state somewhere else. That exists automatically. In other words, there's no direct connection, no hard material connection between one binary state and the other, because it's already hardwired in. And de facto, when you go through 3 of anything and get to the 4th one, the one that comes out of left field, it doesn't come out of left field when you come to it with the process you've been using, but something else in an area you haven't been looking has changed. And that aspect that has changed is the same on the first three and different on the one that's changed. So in fact, it really hasn't changed at all. All you've done is move to a place where some new rules apply. And this means that the laws of physics as we know them are not constants at all. They do not apply everywhere. They have to fall apart when you take that final step. It's not that they fall apart. It's that something else applies, and they don't. So moving from class to class to class, when you take steps in a progression, you end up with that fourth step. Watch the fourth step. It's a doozy. We talk frequently about, let me give you the date first. It's the 29th of June, Wednesday, 1994. We talk frequently about the concept of justification and trying to get down to first-level justification, where we are dealing with thought, knowledgeability, and desire. In fact, it's not really getting down to first-level justification, because thought, knowledgeability, and desire are the intrinsics that we feel based on our genetic programming. Now, according to mental relativity theory, genetic programming occurs in the DNA, and it is the mean average of all the experiential experiences, the experiential database of every creature that lived up until the point that it's procreated. In other words, our own genetic code is being altered by our own experience, changing the value of instinct, the direction and value of instinct, based upon the experience of the individual. However, the individual is averaged in with everything that came before, meaning that we end up with a very heavy base of instinct that's very hard to change. Now, I'm sure there is a mechanism for that base of instinct to be balanced against current experience in such a way that experience does have an impact, even in one lifespan, of something of a great and catastrophic nature, is going to really offset the programming that's already in there. For example, if someone leads a life which is very close to instinct, there's not going to be much change in the genetic base. It's not going to add anything to it. It's merely not going to alter it. However, if one leads a life that's completely contrary to instinctual base, then in that case, it's going to alter it considerably, considerably more, shall we say. Still in all, the weight is with the instinct, with the genetic code, and the change that occurs in it is not that great in the course of a single lifespan. However, now we get to today's society. In today's society, we have no direct connection with survival. We've gotten so many generations away from survival. We don't have to farm, we don't have to hunt, we don't have to defend ourselves in general against wild animals or even against our own kind because of society. As a result, all the instincts that we have are no longer applicable, and in a very short time, because civilization has been around a lot shorter time than the DNA genetic memory of instinct. So we find ourselves constantly having abilities, thoughts, abilities, knowledge, desire, all of these things that push us in directions that are not appropriate for our current society. Therefore, what we're doing when we get our justifications in order is not getting down to first level justification, which would be purely operating in response to our genetic code, but rather we are balancing that genetic code so that it's completely counterbalanced and we can deal only on the basis of our current experiences as individuals in society for making decisions, not just as in response at all to the genetic code that drives us. That has been nullified or counterbalanced. Okay, it's Saturday, July 2nd, and I just woke up. Again, as usual, with some kind of morning inspiration on the theory. This one has a little bit of personal stuff in it, and I almost hesitate to include it, but since it's part of the gestalt as to how this was arrived at, and also it gives a sense of direction as to how to proceed with it, I need to couch this theoretical concept in a little bit of immediate personal history. Okay, the first thing is I've been having a lot of trouble in the last few months trying to feel feminine as opposed to feeling masculine. I had that trouble when I was first starting out on my journey of transition, and I'm continuing to have that trouble up till this point, but I solved it. And the way I solved it is essentially a key to the difference between left-minded and right-minded views of the world. That's going to have an impact on the terminology we use in creating additional semantic templates for the structure of Dramatica, as well as in alter ego and problem solving. Here's what it turned out to be. I couldn't seem to find my solution looking at Dramatica that I needed. And as we've talked about recently at Screenplay Systems, it's the notion that right-minded are looking for the glue that holds things together, not for the series of steps needed to arrive at a conclusion. As a result, I was frustrated because I could not find anywhere in our structure the terminology, the semantics, that seemed to have a feel to me that would describe the glue that would pull everything together. Now, I narrowed the concepts down with Chris the other day that my personal problems had shifted. We had two stories between us we were working out. He had one story he had to resolve, but then he had another story to resolve in addition to that. His first story was one in which I was the obstacle character, and his second story was one that has some other obstacle. I haven't identified it. I don't think he has yet either. As for me, he was the obstacle in the story that we shared together, just as I was his obstacle. But then I had a second obstacle character in the second story, and this, of course, turned out to be Mary, my SO for all these years. She was my obstacle. Now, in that arrangement, Chris and I resolved the issues that had driven us to create Dramatica and mental relativity by the dynamic relationship between us as a dynamic pair made an obstacle. And when we resolved that, we became a companion pair. That was the way it resolved. Now, this bit of information is very useful here. When you have a dynamic pair relationship between main and obstacle, remember there are the three kinds of relationships that we can have that are indicated in the Build Characters window, and the other two being companion and dependent. And the dependent relationship is one in which essentially you bind together and say that I'm counting on you, I'm not complete without you, or that everything I do, you are the counterpart to that. Chris and I have moved into the other relationship, which is companion, which simply says that the two of us are either along parallel courses, where the two of us are working towards the same purpose but not really assisting each other, or we're working essentially towards the same purpose, but in other words, working in a process that is non-conflictual. But at the same time, we either don't have any positive or negative impact on each other, or indeed, or I guess we would have negative impact. A negative companion relationship would be that we're working with processes, either of which would be appropriate to do the job, but together it diminishes. It's less than the sum of its parts. There's a better definition for companion. I've been looking for one, and it just occurred to me that the companion relationship that's on the negative side is where either effort in and of itself would do the job, but each hinders the other so that they diminish the effort by working together. And the other positive side is that they enhance each other by working together, which is where Chris and I have ended up. So when you have a main obstacle relationship and it's resolved, the characters will swing into a new relationship, either companion or dependent, and it could be positive or it could be negative as a result of resolving the difficulties between them. So this is the after story. This is when we conclude what new direction has been set between these characters as a result of their resolving the story between them. This information should be included in our theoretical material and also available in the program. When we get onto alter ego, that will be good to use in terms of interpersonal relationships, because we have in our personal lives many, many micro stories, much as you have many black holes, you have many stories, and each one needs to be resolved independently, because you cannot resolve them all together with any kind of plan, because that's where chaos lives. Again, right-minded will resolve the many stories holistically. Left-minded will resolve the many stories linearly. However, neither of us has the capacity to resolve all of the many stories together from any kind of enlightenment. It's beyond the level of our enlightenment, and therefore we have to tackle them one by one as we proceed with the process of life, and hope that that we can pull it together. Now, ultimately, the engine that we create for alter ego may be able to track multiple stories at once, and if you can put the information in, keeping in mind that you have the limitation of accuracy due to putting in one and then another and then another, and by the time you put in the last one, it has changed and altered your thinking, which has affected the nature and even existence of the other many stories that you've entered. But assuming that these have been problems that have been with you for a while, and you seem to have locked into a pattern you can't get out of, if you take those ruts, as they were, and you put them all together into the alter ego program, then not much is likely to change on those particular